So the very first thing we need to know is, how do we know God's truth about anything? So
yeah, very important question, isn't it? Like, how do we know?
Yeah. So there's about 5 different ways that we've outlined in our outline that we can start to know truth or think that we know truth.
Yes.
So I'd like to ask you about each of those. Firstly, I'll just summarise them.
Yes.
We've got knowing the truth through hearsay.
Yes.
Knowing the truth through observation.
Yeah.
Knowing truth through intellectual analysis. And in this example, we're going to be speaking intellectual analysis of law specifically. Knowing truth through personal experience and experimentation. And then knowing truth through feeling. So I've got a number of questions about each of those, and I'm interested to hear what you have to say. So let's get started. All right. So
the whole question is, how do we know the truth about anything?
Yeah.
And then there's all these sub-points that we need to cover, which we'll get started on now.
Yeah. So let's start with knowing truth through hearsay.
Right.
So what do we mean by knowing truth through hearsay?
Well, you could put truth in quotation marks here, couldn't you? Because hearsay is when somebody else has told you that something is true. Now, unfortunately, on the planet today, most of us believe what other people tell us, even though we have no evidence or proof that those particular things that are being told to us are actually true. And you see this a lot in gossip, where and the large amount of gossip mags that are around are all sort of going by this hearsay thing, where there's a whole heap of accusations made, a whole heap of inflammatory comments made, but nobody really knows what the truth actually was. And what we've found personally is the media and other people who are involved in this kind of thing have no intention of really helping you find out what the truth was, because it's not in their interest to. It's like, it's more in their interest to just make it all inflammatory, and so that your emotion gets tied into the whole examination of the material without there being any real knowledge of what the truth is or what truth isn't. So, but unfortunately, hearsay, if we can call it that, which is just hearing things from other people that we have no evidence or proof actually happened or existed, but believing them, is a common way that most people think they know truth on the planet.
And so there you've talked about, a rumour mill or gossip and things like that. But it's even more basic than that, isn't it? Yeah. Like, my mum taught me the truth about how to do the laundry, and told me you don't... This
is the best way.
Yes, you wash certain things in cold, otherwise the colours will run, or whatever it is. That's really sort of believing I know a truth through hearsay, isn't it?
Yes, and most of the hearsay type truths, many of them do come from other types of truths, which is personal observations and other things getting handed down by generation and so forth. But a lot of them also come not keeping up with the times, where something might have applied 50 years ago, but it doesn't apply anymore because there's new technology or there's new fabric or there's new whatever it is that has now allowed for a different type of treatment of these kind of things to occur. And so the problem with hearsay is that it often gets said once and repeated thousands of times without there even being a single piece of evidence that it's actually true or not. And this, as you point out, comes a lot from our families. Where dad points, dad might not know the engine very well, and he points to the carburetor and says that's the injector. And you grow up thinking it's one thing when it's actually another. You know what I mean? Yeah. And these kind of things commonly happen inside of families, where family belief systems are perpetrated through hearsay. And also belief systems of a country are perpetrated in much the same manner, where, there's a belief, for example, in most countries, we are the best country. Well, what proof is there is that? And should there be such a thing as the best country? And should there be countries at all? Those kind of things are never considered. Yes. Because no one's had an open enough mind to consider them because of the predisposition of hearsay, what that causes us to believe inside of ourselves at a young age that then gets perpetrated into our old age and also carries through, unfortunately, right the way through after we've passed and into the spirit world.
So is it possible to know truth through hearsay? Like, my dad could point at the carburettor and it is the carburettor, and forevermore I just know that that's the carburettor.
Correct.
Yes.
It is possible.
It is possible.
It is possible. But it does require, doesn't it, the sincerity on part of the person who's saying the material, that they've actually validated the truth of that material that they're perpetrating or repeating upon, to others.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it is possible, certainly, to know truth through hearsay, but it depends a lot on the emotional condition of the person from whom you're receiving it.
Yes.
Or from where the emotional condition of where they received it from, and so forth. So you are depending a lot on the sincerity, the purity, the ethics, the morality of the people you're hearing it from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that probably leads me to my next question, which is, what are the drawbacks of knowing truth via hearsay?
Yes, so obviously there's many drawbacks. There's some advantages, obviously, in that you don't have to go and investigate it yourself. But unfortunately, unless you do, you don't really know whether it's the truth or not. So that's, I don't know if you could say that's an advantage. And the drawbacks are that you don't really know if it's the truth or not without there being a lot of validity checking and validation of the information you're receiving. And unfortunately, with the way information is rapidly dispersed nowadays through the internet and other technologies, it's very hard to validate whether something was actually true or not. And you can actually go to sites now like Wikipedia, which are thought to be true, and find a lot of error on them because they have repeated the error of the media, for example, and other sources. And so you can't even really be sure that those particular sites are telling you the truth on some subjects, and particularly on subjects that relate to other people or other people's experiences and so forth. Then there's also the drawbacks related to history and her story. A person wants to tell a version of the story that seems to make them look pretty good and make the other person look pretty bad generally.
Yes.
And so, because of these emotional injuries, you get versions of history which are not really history, but they're his story. And they're not the real truth, they're not the actual story, the actual events that happened. They are just the perceptions, and oftentimes distorted perceptions, of people who have written those particular stories. Bearing in mind, of course, that most people who do write about history have what they would see to be as valid reasons for keeping their story about it and perpetrating that story down the line. And frequently those reasons are to distort history in order to have a different viewpoint of a culture or a nation or an individual. And so there's a lot of disadvantages of this hearsay versions of truth.
And would you say, obviously, just what you were mentioning about, history being recorded by the conquerors and those kinds of things, or even people promoting a certain lifestyle or promoting a certain thing and saying this is the truth, eventually, inevitably it seems, and I believe inevitably through the working of God's laws, the untruth within those things is exposed, isn't it? And is that why people become quite disillusioned? Because they've always relied on hearsay.
Well, you say inevitably, but inevitably is true, but oftentimes it's tens of thousands of years or thousands of years after the events. And so, unfortunately, this has a very negative effect on the people who believed those particular things for that period of time. Until they actually discovered what the actual truth was, they believed a falsehood, and frequently they make decisions and base their life experiences and their life future decisions upon those falsehoods that they hear. So it does have very negative consequences when the truth, so-called truth, and it not being truth, is repeated over and over and over and over again. And you see this particularly with religion, because religions have such a long-term effect on the childhood of an individual. They then can also, obviously have a huge effect on our adult choices and decisions. And so if a religious item or thought is incorrect but is hearsay truth, there is a lot of motivation inside of the individual to carry that truth to their grave and even beyond. And so it can cause a lot of damage to the individual who does that. So initially, when you look at hearsay, it might seem quite innocent, but actually it is very, very dangerous in the long run to most of our lives. And in fact, once many people, after most people pass and they start seeing the actual truth, they often have huge amounts of emotion to release regarding the fact that they were taught untruth for such a long period of time by the different sources that it came from. Yeah. But there is obviously a personal responsibility here too. We must recognise when we are involved in hearsay, whether it's by perpetrating it or listening to it, rather than actually listening to the actual truth. And this is where I see the majority of people on the planet today are really falling down, because there is no internal recognition of the damaging effects of the potential damaging effects of hearsay, and the potential damaging effects of firstly creating it, and then secondly perpetrating it, and then thirdly listening to it and imbibing it and making choices upon it. And these kind of things can affect our life very severely. And it's very important that we see how severely. And once we see how severely, it's highly likely that we won't repeat hearsay until we've validated information further.
Yeah, and so it almost sounds like you're saying that knowing truth through hearsay is actually not knowing truth.
Well, it's the potential to know truth.
But do I really know it?
But you won't know it inside of yourself as an experience. It's just the potential. It's just a source of information, which may be valid or may not be. And it really needs to be double checked before you could actually validate it as truth, as God's truth.
And could you say that that's a potential benefit of hearsay if I hear it with full knowledge that I'm listening to something that is not established inside of me? It could be the possibility for investigation.
Yes.
And that leads us to our further ways of knowing truth.
Exactly. It can help us in our guide for, finding out the truth. Because the question began with, how do we know the truth about anything? And this is one way of finding out some truth, but not a way necessarily of believing it. It's a way of getting information, if you like, source of information that may be truthful or may not be, depending upon the source and depending upon, and sources today often that are so-called or felt to be truthful sources often repeat hearsay where the actual hearsay is false. And this is very much the case with the media. We have found one media corporation might be very unethical and create a whole lot of, in our case, they've created just a whole lot of lies. And then what they do is they repeat that, and then another more truthful source of media sees the media doing that, assuming that they have been ethical and moral in the way they've collected that information, and then they repeat those lies. So you can't even guarantee that a truthful source normally is actually giving you the truth on the matter without there being some evidence, that can be provided through other methods other than the actual media or what's written in a paper or what's recorded on telly or whatever.
And if I could expand beyond the media, also government institutions, they so-called government...
they're very good at this.
They're very good. They often dictate how a whole country should be educated about a certain topic. Health, lifestyle, diet, relationships even. They mandate government, this is our established policy and what must be taught in our institutions. But very often what they've established is not based on solid science
And also, so oftentimes, if it's historical, not based on actual fact of what actually occurred, unfortunately. And on top of that, you've got things like what we eat and what we wear and all of these different things. We're told, oftentimes what we should eat and what we should not eat and so forth by governments without there being any valid information provided.
Often in the face of contrary information.
Correct.
It's become outdated because there's been more fact established, or even in the establishing of the dietary guideline,
Yep.
there's a lot of financial...
Exactly. It's a purposeful lie
yes.
in order to promote commerce in a certain industry, for example.
Yes.
And you see that a lot with meat eating, for example.
Yeah.
Yep. So,
Yeah.
you know, we see all this, the evidence of hearsay type of truth everywhere in our lives, and you can see why it is such a dangerous thing to engage. And yet, you can see by the number of gossip mags around the place that people love it. People just love it. They eat it all up, you know. And a lot of times they eat it all up for other emotional reasons. They don't even half the time believe what they're reading. They just go, "Oh, wouldn't it be funny if that was true?" type of feeling. And you know, obviously there's not much moral or ethics involved in that. So
No. All right. So to summarise, knowing the truth by hearsay is, by that we mean the possibility to know a truth by just hearing it from another source. And what you're saying is that while there is some potential that you might actually hear what is true, it's not necessarily known, or it's not established within you.
And it can't be.
It
can't be because you have to validate it before it could be established.
And that's the major drawback with trying to learn truth through hearsay.
Exactly. Yeah, you need to validate everything. And how do you validate everything? Go and get another piece of hearsay and go, well, now that I've got 10 pieces of hearsay, now it's the truth. You know, obviously not, because they could all just be repeating from the same source, the same information.
Yeah, or from different sources that, like the internet is kind of crazy making like that. You can find anything to meet a million different points of view.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. All right.
So obviously God's truth, which is what we're talking about here, is not going to be easily established through hearsay.
No.
Whether it's hearsay from a religious icon or an economic icon or a government or a parent, or someone who you trust or don't trust, whatever source it's from, it always will need to be validated.
All right. So let's move on